Today we're going to be recapping chapter 7, where we left off of functionalism and structuralism. So I'm going to read out the slides just in case you guys can't see them, and then I'm going to also talk from my notes and everything else. So recapping, structuralism focuses on the consciousness of the human mind and breaking it down into basic elements. Titchener created and implemented structuralism. In turn, his efforts gave psychology its precedence and respect as an academic subject and scientific entity. Structuralism failed due to its over-perfectionist views and focus on aspects of consciousness of psychology with no evolution/application of the research results. Experimentalist was an informal club created by E.B. Titchener, and it was only for men, but it offended and hindered women in the field of psychology. E.B. Titchener died, and when he died, structuralism died. It kind of goes back to what I was talking about on Wednesday when I said that we have a theory in place or an approach in place for a long time and it answers our questions, but after a while people kind of get bored with that, or it doesn't answer our questions, or it doesn't evolve with the evolution of man in society. So now we're gonna go define functionalism. Functionalism. There you go. Tripping over my words. Okay. America's psychology. Functionalism. People called functionalism America's psychology, and I will tell you why after I define functionalism. So functionalism is an evolutionary theory of psychology focused on the application of consciousness and its elements instead of the structure and analysis of consciousness itself. So it goes from post-Civil War to a period of growth. Now, during this period of growth, there were a lot of differences after the Civil War. There was the Reconstruction of the South, the westward expansion, the railroad building, and technological growth. So with all of this growth happening, it was only right that we started growing consciously or becoming asking bigger questions. Just for example, when you grow up, when you're a child, you don't have the same questions or the same mindset that you do as an adult. And so that growth process allowed for new things to surface and new interests to emerge, especially in psychology. Again, the change from one theory that seemed to be working till it stopped and a revolution occurred to evolve functionalism. Why was functionalism considered America's psychology? It was prominent in the US, so all of these questions, like they wanted to study, psychologists wanted to study psychology and the application of studying children behavior, animal behavior, the insane. They just wanted to basically say, how can I implement this in my life? And then from that came a concept of individualism. So individual responsibility was a very big thing for the state character. And it was basically that people had to take responsibility for their actions regardless of where they started from. If you started from the bottom, the middle, the top, you still had to take responsibility for how you were born and your outcomes, which is pretty crazy. And then Herbert Spencer coined the term survival of the fittest, and he basically played off of Darwin's natural survival of the fittest. So basically the animal with the better traits to survive their environment would continue to reproduce and the other weak ones would die off. So he took that and applied it to humans severely. He was basically saying that winners won because they were the fittest and losers lost because they weren't the fittest. Survivors were winners of a fierce battle for limited resources. So if you were poor because you didn't get those, you didn't fight hard enough for those limited resources. And since you didn't fight, basically the evolution of this process was inevitable, and Spencer believed that we shouldn't help people or we shouldn't tamper with this evolution. And that whole theory became social Darwinism. Next, we'll go to the two most important schools. So they're the Chicago Functionalists and the Columbia Functionalists. And these schools were most impactful for functionalism. They basically showed that functionalism wasn't just a theory, it was a state of mind. You lived like this and you thought like this. So the Chicago Functionalists, the school was opened in 1892, and it was created by J.D. Rockefeller and other Baptists who wanted a Baptist university. So they shelled out $10 million to create this university, and then had William Rainey Harper spearhead this university. He was the president, and he picked all the teachers out. So he picked a teacher that most of the teachers came from Clark University, but he picked a young man who graduated with his doctorate from Yale at 18. His name was John Dewey, and he went to Michigan and taught psychology and philosophy first, and he wrote a text in psychology in 1886, which was used on numerous campuses. It went from this university to a whole bunch. He was born in Burlington, Vermont, graduated from the University of Vermont in 1879, studied humanities as an undergrad in evolutionary thinking. Then he did his doctorate at Johns Hopkins. He wrote his first paper that was considered the starting point of American functionalism, and he published the Reflex Arc in Psychology article. That article had his approaches to the reflex, because traditional philosophers and psychologists thought that reflexes had three separate elements to it. And the first element was the stimulus producing sensations. The second element was central processing, producing an idea. And the third was motor response, or the act. And then Dewey believed, though, that if reflexes were broken into three parts, it was artificial. But he never actually combated that theory. He just said, okay, functionalism has this definition, and although I don't agree with it, I'm just going to do more research with it, actually. He believed that reflexes were an integrated, coordinated whole that serves the function of adapting the organism to its environment. And he wanted to, and with that, he basically had this learning school. It was a laboratory school that he created to study exactly how children learned education the best in the classroom. Seeing a light means pain will occur on contact. Basically what he did was, when he was explaining his definition of reflexes, he said that things were clumped together. So the child seeing the candle and reaching for the candle would be clumped together, as well as another clump would be the child touching the flame and then withdrawing. And then once those two clusters came together, that would then make a new association to that specific child, that candle, when they see any other candle, they know that candles will burn, or that memory comes back. He wrote The School and Society in 1899, and then we're going to go to his, not successor, but the guy that came right after him after he moved on to a different university, James R. Engel. And his contribution to psychology was research. He researched things like reaction time, but basically with him, he rejected all of structuralism, and he doesn't think it came first. You know that term, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? He said that functionalism could act on its own without having to know the elements of consciousness. And then next we go to Harvey Carr, and he created mazes, which was great because he used these mazes these mazes and they helped students. He contributed to Chicago functionalism through his influence on students in publishing Psychology, a Study on Mental Activity. And then when he ran the laboratory in Chicago, he made sure that students were really impacted by looking at mental activity. Then we're going to go to the Colombian functionalist. So, James McKean Cattle, he was the fourth president of the APA, and he was the one who you can hold responsible for mental testing. He said having a measurement of something does great for further research and experiments, or just courses in academia. So he implemented testing for incoming freshmen, or just mental tests in general. I'm going to read the slide now. Mental testing. He was a professor for psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. He established a laboratory, and the measured tests were mental tests and measurements. He went to Columbia and expanded these tests. He had 10 at first, and he expanded way more after he went to Columbia. And then after he did all of these tests, he got kind of bored, and he went to trying to professionalize psychology. So he created the journals which are known today, the Psychology Review and the Science. And Science Journal is the biggest journal today. I've even written papers that the articles come from the Science Journal. Then we'll go to Edward Thorndike. I learned him in behavior because I'm taking learning. So at first, he did his dissertation for his PhD on animal psychology, and he was the president of the APA in 1912. He was the first president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and he was the first president ever for that. He was big in educational psychology, famous amongst researcher psychologists, and he studied cats learning to escape from puzzle boxes. His boxes weren't created or manufactured very nice, but he got the job done. And he was in a way a pioneer because of these studies for comparative psychology. He was famous for trial and error learning, so the cats made certain connections between stimuli in these boxes. It was often called connectionism. And his general principles were the law of effect and the law of exercise. The law of exercise stated that the connection between stimulus, situations, and response would be strengthened with practice. And then the law of effect was very similar to B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning. It said that a response that produced a satisfying effect will most likely reoccur, and then if it produced a negative effect, it was less likely to occur. Last person was Robert Woodworth, and I'm going to read off the slide. He read the William James, The Principle, like everybody else. It changed his life because he was just a math teacher and psychology teacher in high school. And then he ended up becoming, he dedicated his life to going back to school and studying either psychology or philosophy. Dynamic psychology. It was an emphasis on the drives and organismic variables. He influenced students and works created lasting impressions on experimental psychology. He defines psychology as both a mental process and a behavior process, which linked with behaviorism and some traditional psychology definitions. In regards to his emphasis on drives and organismic variables, he ended up writing a 3-page article for educational psychology. He had transfer of training, which is learning one thing and then performing like-minded tasks, because during his, when he was teaching in Columbia, he wanted kids to learn Greek, and in order to take zoology, they had to know Greek. But then other universities had courses that didn't correlate, so him and Thorndike decided to look at transfer training. So they took something like zoology, and they took something like a triangle, and you learned the diameter of a triangle, and you looked at a rectangle, and then saw whatever you learned from that triangle, was it enough necessary information to be able to tell the diameter of a rectangle. And so things that have more like-minded tasks are easier to be related and interconnected. He had the SOR model, which is understanding stimulus, response, and also the organism's drive for doing so. That's better than the SR model. So the SR model, you just have to know the stimulus and the response, but this is learning the organism that is making that stimulus and response. Then there was the dynamic of psychology and the dynamics of psychology and dynamics of psychology. There were books, and they were looking at the motivational factors influencing behavior. Then he had a handout that looked like a book, and it became a textbook, and it was on the experimental psychology. It was used in many campuses after that. They called it a Bible. And so basically functionalism was more applicable than structuralism, so it kept growing with the time. And I think that's very important, that things can basically, in a way, be like a snake, shed skin as it gets bigger, because the old things weren't quite working. So then functionalism was a place where things could start being used more. He also implemented the independent and dependent variable, and that was, he didn't coin the term, but it was important for psychology. Forgot to note that. But I do think functionalism was the gateway to behaviorism and other areas of psychology. Thank you.